Wyoming Territory, spring of 1879, the wind cut across the open plain like it meant to peel the skin off a man's bones. And still the woman trudged forward, coat wrapped tight around her and her two children beside her, both so thin they looked like shadows in the dusk. Rhetta Orrin had not cried since leaving Cheyenne 3 days ago. She would not start now, not with her boots split and her son coughing behind her. She tightened her grip on little Maisie's hand and glanced back at her boy, Micah, who limped along with his coat dragging off one shoulder. He was 9 and trying hard to be brave, but the fever in his eyes was climbing. She had made a mistake. She knew that now. The stagecoach had dropped them at the wrong junction, too far south, too close to nothing. The farm where her cousin had promised them shelter was still 20 miles west, and they had walked halfway already. The sun dipped lower behind the hills, and Rhetta's heart pounded from something more than the cold. Then she saw him. A lone rider on a tall roan horse came into view ahead, cutting across the ridge like part of the land itself. Tall in the saddle, wide-brimmed hat pulled low, rifle slung behind him. He stopped when he saw them and dismounted without hurry, like he had all the time in the world. Rhetta froze. Her first instinct was to shield the children behind her. "Evenin'," the stranger said, voice rough like river gravel but not unkind. He had dark hair, a weathered face, and eyes like summer storms, quiet, watching everything. "You got no business being out on this land with night common." "Where you headed?" "We're fine," Rhetta said, chin lifting. "We do not need help." The man glanced at Micah, who had sunk to one knee, panting. "That's so?" he asked softly. Rhetta's lips trembled. "My cousin's farm is west. We'll make it." He looked west, where only hills and wind waited. "Not tonight, you will not. My boy is sick. I cannot stop now." He stepped forward slowly, holding his hands out like she was a skittish foal. "Name is Vaughn Prescott. I got a cabin 2 miles north, warm fire, water. You and the young'uns can rest there tonight." "No one helps for nothing," Rhetta said, her voice cracking. Vaughn's jaw ticked. "I do." She hesitated, then Micah gave a soft whimper and crumpled. Vaughn caught him before he hit the ground. Rhetta gasped. "Do not touch him," but the cowboy already had the boy in his arms. "He is burning up. Come on now. The girl can ride with me. You walk beside." Rhetta's legs moved before she gave them permission. They reached the cabin just as the sky turned black. Vaughn lit a lantern and stoked the stove while Rhetta hovered over Micah, eyes wild. The place was small but neat, with a cot in the corner and a rocking chair by the hearth. A pot of beans simmered on the stove, Maisie curled up in a blanket near the fire. Rhetta sat beside her son, brushing hair from his damp forehead. "I can make a willow bark tea," Vaughn said, handing her a steaming mug. "It helps with fever." She took it, fingers brushing his. "Thank you." He nodded once and stepped back. Later, after the children were asleep, Vaughn sat across from her, quietly sipping coffee. The silence stretched, but it was not heavy. "You runnin' from something?" he asked finally. Rhetta looked down. Her hands were shaking. He waited. "From who I used to be," she said. Vaughn did not blink. "What does that mean?" She looked at him then, really looked. He had a kind face, rough around the eyes, but steady. She took a breath. "I married a man I should not have. He ran a saloon in Cheyenne. I worked there too after we lost our farm. When he died, folks said I was no better than the girls upstairs. I tried to find work, but no one would take me. I have 2 mouths to feed, so I packed us up and left." Vaughn leaned forward a little, elbows on his knees. "You did what you had to. I do not want pity. You are not getting any." She laughed once, bitter and short. "You think I am worth helping after all that?" Something shifted in his face. He stood up and came to kneel before her. "You looked away just now," he said softly. "Like you were ashamed." Rhetta did not answer. Vaughn touched her hand, careful and sure. "Your past does not matter to my heart." Her eyes filled with sudden tears. She looked away again, but this time it was not fear, it was something breaking open. "You do not even know me," she whispered. "I know enough. I saw you carrying your boy across the prairie. I saw how you kept them warm before yourself. That is the kind of woman I would ride 100 miles to find." She could not find her voice. He stood then, giving her space. "You and the kids stay as long as you need. I got more beans on the stove, and a dog that will bark if trouble comes." Rhetta looked at him, and for the first time in months her chest did not ache from dread. Vaughn Prescott had appeared out of nowhere like a storm rolling in, but there was shelter in him. There was peace. She whispered, "Thank you." He tipped his hat. "Get some sleep now. Tomorrow is another day." As he walked to the door, Rhetta watched him go with something new blooming in her chest. Hope, maybe, or something close to it. And for the first time since she had run from everything she used to be, she wanted to stay. The frost lifted by morning, leaving the earth soft beneath Vaughn's boots. He was already outside splitting wood when Rhetta stepped onto the porch, Maisie in her arms, wrapped in one of his patched quilts. She didn't speak at first, just watched the clean arc of his axe, the steady rhythm he kept like it anchored him. "You have a way of making silence feel easier," she said finally. He looked up, brushing sawdust from his shirt. "You needed quiet. I didn't expect it to feel like kindness." She set Maisie down, and the girl wandered off toward the narrow stream behind the cabin, boots squelching in the damp grass. Vaughn nodded toward the stump beside the woodpile. "Sit a while." "There's coffee on the stove." Rhetta hesitated, then took the offer. She came back with 2 tin cups and handed him one with a hand that no longer trembled. He took it, fingers grazing hers without comment. "Micah's still sleeping," she said. "He ought to be." "Fever broke just before sunup." Relief softened her shoulders. "I didn't hear you get up. You were finally resting. Figured I'd keep the fire lit and let you be." She looked out toward the hills. "You always lived this far from town," started out in Laramie. "Fought to keep some land after my brother passed. Took a while, but this patch stuck. Got cattle now, a few good horses. No one bothers me here. Must get lonely." Vaughn didn't answer right away. "Sometimes, but I make do." Rhetta turned the cup in her hands. "I used to think I could make do with less. I told myself I didn't need anyone so long as the children had food, but I was wrong." He leaned on the axe handle. "You're not the only one who's been wrong." She looked over, surprised. "I asked a woman to marry me once. Thought I'd give her a better life out here. She left before the first snowfall, said everything was too hard, said I was too quiet." Rhetta's voice was low. "She was wrong." Vaughn gave a small shake of his head. "She wanted something else." "That's her right." They sat in the hush that followed, the wind stirring the tall grass. A hawk circled far above. Maisie returned, holding a smooth stone with both hands like it was treasure. "Mama, look, it's shaped like a heart." Rhetta smiled as Vaughn crouched down beside the girl. "That's a good find," he said, brushing dirt from the stone's edge. "You hold on to that, it's lucky." Maisie beamed and tucked it into her coat pocket. After she wandered back inside, Rhetta stood. "We should get moving today. I can't stay where I'm not meant to." Vaughn looked up at her. "And who says you're not?" She crossed her arms, the wind tugging at the hem of her dress. "I've never had a place where I was welcome without earning it." "You didn't ask to be welcomed," he said. "You just needed safety. That's not something you earn. That's something decent folks give without condition." She didn't reply, not with words, but her eyes met his then, steady and searching. He saw the weight she carried, what she'd done to survive, who she'd lost along the way, and he didn't flinch from it. "You ever think about startin' over?" he asked. "Every hour." "I reckon I know a place you could." She didn't look away this time. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not. And if I'm not who you thought I was?" "I haven't thought you were anyone but who you are." She stepped closer, quiet as the wind. "You saw me yesterday, and still you asked nothing in return." Vaughn's voice was low. "Because I know what it is to be seen and not judged." He waited, watched her eyes flicker with something raw and unfamiliar. Not fear, not shame. Something like the edges of trust. She reached for his hand, and this time she didn't pull away when their fingers met. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "We'll find out," he answered, holding her hand like he meant to keep it. Behind them, the door creaked, and Micah's voice called out, hoarse but awake. Rhetta turned, and Vaughn followed her inside. That evening, she helped stir the stew while Vaughn whittled a toy horse for Micah, who sat propped up near the hearth. Maisie braided grass she'd gathered by the stream. There was no talk of leaving. When the stew was finished and the lanterns lit, Vaughn poured her a bowl and handed it over without ceremony. She took it with a small nod. "You always this quiet when you're content," he smiled, just enough to show the lines around his mouth. "Only when I got everything I need close by." Rhetta held his gaze, and the silence that followed didn't need filling, not anymore. The snowmelt brought mud to the yard, thick and sucking beneath boots, but Vaughn didn't mind the work. He'd been up since dawn mending a broken fence rail along the south slope. When he returned to the cabin, Rhetta was kneeling in the vegetable patch, sleeves rolled to the elbow, turning the soil with a short-handled spade. Her brow was damp, her braid tucked under a kerchief that had once been red, now faded to rust. She didn't look up when he stepped into the shadow of the porch. "You plantin' already?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "There's no sense in waiting," she said, still focused on the furrow. "If frost comes again, I'll cover the chutes." He watched her for a moment. "You're not planning to leave, then?" She sat back on her heels. "I meant to, I couldn't." Vaughn leaned against the post. "What changed?" "I stopped pretending I had somewhere else to be." She stood, brushing the dirt from her palms. "You were right, I needed safety, but now I want more than that." He handed her the rag, and their hands touched longer than they had to. "I started clearing the far field," he said. "There's room enough for another cabin if you want your own space." "I don't." Her voice didn't waver. "Not anymore." Inside, Micah was sitting upright in the rocker, carving a piece of soft pine Vaughn had given him 2 days earlier. The boy's hands were still thin, but steadier now, and his cheeks had taken on color again. Maisie was on the floor, humming to herself as she pulled thread through a patch of cloth Vaughn had found in a trunk beneath his bed. Rhetta watched them a moment before speaking. "I used to think I'd never see them safe like this. I thought the world had taken too much from us." Vaughn stepped over to the table, pouring hot water into a basin she'd set out earlier. "It took plenty from me too," he said. "But I reckon it left just enough behind to start again." She moved to help him, folding a cloth and dipping it into the basin. "Tell me about your brother." He didn't answer right away, then he pulled over a chair, sat, and rested his arms on his knees. He was older by 4 years. "Raised me after our folks passed. He fought hard for the land we had. When the fever came through Laramie, he stayed behind while I rode out for medicine. By the time I got back, he was gone." Rhetta folded the cloth again, pressing it against the side of the basin. "I'm sorry. He died believing something good could still grow here. I think about that every time I plant." She returned to the window, gazing out at the low hills beyond the pasture. "My mother used to say God hides second chances in the most unlikely places." He rose and joined her by the sill. "You think this place is unlikely? I think I never would have come this way if everything else hadn't fallen apart." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe it fell apart just right." Rhetta turned toward him, expression unreadable. "You're not the sort of man who says things just to fill silence." "No, so when you told me my past don't matter to your heart, it still don't," he said before she could finish. "What matters is who you are when you wake up, and who you choose to be when there's no one watching." She looked down, her throat moving as she swallowed. "I've carried shame like a stone in my coat for years. Even when I ran, I didn't feel free of it. You don't need to carry it here." "I don't know how to lay it down." He reached out, hands steady against the edge of her sleeve. "You already have," Micah called from the rocker. "Mama, can I show you something?" She turned, her hand falling from Vaughn's only slowly. "What is it, baby?" The boy held up the small carving. It was a horse, rough and uneven, but unmistakable in form. "I made this for Mr. Prescott." "I want to thank him." Rhetta crossed the room and knelt beside her son. "You give it to him yourself, sweetheart." Micah stood and walked over, holding the figure out with both hands. Vaughn crouched to meet him, accepting it like it was made of silver. "Thank you, Micah," he said, voice quiet. "That means a great deal to me." The boy smiled and returned to his seat. Later, when the sun slipped behind the ridge and shadows lengthened across the yard, Rhetta stepped outside again. Vaughn was brushing down the roan near the lean-to. She handed him a folded scrap of fabric, a piece of Maisie's stitching, now finished into a square with a neat border. "She wants you to have this, says it's for your table." "I'll use it every night," he said, tucking it into his vest pocket. They stood side by side as the twilight deepened. "I don't know what I'd have done if you hadn't come down that ridge," she said. "I reckon I was meant to." She turned toward him fully. "I want you to know I don't take what you've given us for granted." This piece, it's a gift I never thought I'd find. You don't have to earn it, Rhetta. She stepped closer, hands clasped in front of her. Then let me choose it. He reached for her then, slow and sure, and she met him halfway. There was no rush to the moment, no need to name what had already taken root. When her head came to rest against his chest, he wrapped both arms around her and held her like he'd been waiting his whole life to do it. In the stillness, beneath the first stars of evening, nothing more needed saying. By the second week of April, the mornings had turned soft and gold-edged, and the days stretched out longer, the air rich with the scent of thawed earth. Vaughn had begun hitching the draft mare to the plow just after sunup, carving long furrows into the field that lay east of the cabin. Rhetta walked beside him, a basket looped over her arm, scattering seed into the soil with steady fingers. They didn't speak much during the work, but the rhythm of moving side by side filled something in her that words never had. That afternoon, while Maisie napped with her head tucked against a pillow stitched from old calico, Rhetta sat at the table sorting dried herbs Vaughn had stored in crocks near the back wall. Micah stood nearby, watching the steam curl from the kettle. "You ever think about tacking in borders?" he asked Vaughn, his voice cautious. Vaughn folded a flour sack and set it aside. "Not since Lee passed. Why?" Micah shrugged. "I was thinking, maybe we're sorta like boarders. Except Mama's cookin' and I'm helpin' with chores." Rhetta turned her head toward the boy. "You think we're visitors?" "I don't know. We didn't bring anything. Folks who stay usually pay or earn their keep." Vaughn crouched down until he was eye level with Micah. "You're not passin' through, son. This is home as long as you want it." Micah's throat bobbed, but he nodded and looked away quickly, pretending to study a knot in the table. That evening, Rhetta carried a tin lantern out to the barn while Vaughn brushed down the mare. She leaned her shoulder against the post, watching the dust rise with each stroke of the curry comb. "I got a letter once," she said, "from my father, years after he left. He wrote that he regretted the drink, the way he'd let it take hold of him. Said he prayed I'd never end up needing a man the way my mama did." Vaughn set the brush down. "Did you write back?" "No, I burned it." He stepped out of the stall, wiping his hands on a cloth. "You afraid of becoming like her?" "I was." She stayed with him through beatings and empty cupboards. "Said it was duty." He studied her a moment. "You don't owe anyone that kind of loyalty." "I know that now, but back then I thought survival meant staying quiet." Vaughn rested his hand on the stall door. "You weren't quiet when you left Cheyenne." "I wasn't brave either. I was desperate. Sometimes that's the same thing." She looked down, fingering the edge of her shawl. "I never thought I'd have a say in what came next. I figured it'd be more running, more nights on the edge of someone else's land. You gotta say here." Rhetta stepped closer, lantern light catching the curve of her cheek. "What if I don't know how to build something that lasts?" He looked at her then, long and sure. "You already are." Inside, the children's laughter filtered through the walls, soft and distant. Rhetta leaned her head against Vaughn's shoulder, and he didn't move, just let her rest there, breathing in time with the horses. Later, when they sat on the porch steps watching the sky turn the color of coal ash, Rhetta pulled her shawl tighter and glanced toward him. "You've never asked what I want," she said. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She stared out past the fence-line, where the wind had begun to stir the tall grass. "I want to stay. I want to plant and harvest and see these children grow up with dirt on their hands and peace in their hearts." Vaughn reached over, took her hand in his. "Then that's what we'll do." "I don't have much to offer." "You have everything that matters," she swallowed hard. "I keep thinking about that day on the ridge, how I looked away. I remember, you could have turned back. I couldn't." She met his eyes fully then, no flicker of shame left in her. "Why not?" He turned her hand over in his, thumb brushing along the calloused edge of her palm. "Because your past don't matter to my heart, only you do." She drew in a breath that trembled at the edges. "Then I won't look away again," and she didn't. Not when he leaned in, not when their foreheads touched, not when the porch creaked beneath them and the last light of day settled soft across their shoulders like a blessing. By late May, the land had softened into full green. The wind no longer cut it carried warmth and the scent of lilac from the scrub near the creek. Rhetta stood beneath the cottonwoods, rolling dough for biscuits atop a plank set across two barrels. Maisie sat nearby with a needle and scrap muslin, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Vaughn was down near the pasture with Micah, teaching him how to saddle the younger gelding. They moved slow, careful. From where she stood, Rhetta could hear Micah asking questions, Vaughn answering in patient tones. Nothing rushed, nothing strained. Rhetta wiped her hands on her apron and looked toward the slope behind the barn, where sunlight filtered down like something holy. She hadn't thought about Cheyenne in weeks, not because she avoided it, but because life here had filled her hands so completely there hadn't been room for the ache. "Miss Rhetta," Maisie said suddenly, "what's a wedding?" Rhetta blinked. "Where'd you hear that?" Aunt June said Mr. and Mrs. Morris had won before they got their baby, said they had cake and everything. Rhetta leaned down. "A wedding is when two people promise to stay together. Take care of each other, share everything they have." Maisie's brow wrinkled. "Like you and Mr. Vaughn," Rhetta felt her breath catch. "We haven't had a wedding." Maisie looked back down at her cloth. "You share everything, though." Rhetta's hands stilled. The girl wasn't wrong. That evening after dinner, Vaughn sat out on the porch steps with his boots off, legs stretched toward the last of the sunlight. Rhetta brought him a tin mug of chicory and sat beside him, all quiet between them until the whippoorwills started up in the trees. "I've been thinking," she said. He turned his head, waiting. "There's a preacher comes through once a month from Buffalo, stays over at the Johnsons. I asked him when he might come again." Vaughn set his mug aside. "You planning to get baptized?" "I was thinking more of a wedding." He was still. Not surprised, just still, like the thought had been waiting inside him all along. "I don't have a ring," he said. "We don't need one. No fancy dress, no guests, only the children and the preacher." Vaughn nodded slowly. "Then let's do it." She leaned into him, resting against his side. "It doesn't need to be a grand thing." He looked toward the barn where Micah and Maisie were chasing fireflies. "It already is." The day the preacher came, Rhetta wore a dress the color of pale cornflower, one she'd hemmed herself from fabric Vaughn found in an old trunk. Her hair was pinned up the way her mother had once worn it, and Maisie had tucked a sprig of wild yarrow into the back. Vaughn wore a clean shirt, sleeves rolled, collar open. His hair was combed, and he'd shaved close that morning. Micah stood beside him, taller now, his hand steady on Vaughn's arm when the preacher spoke the words. They were married beneath the cottonwoods, the four of them with the preacher, a Bible, and the big sky over them like a blessing. When Rhetta's voice caught on the words and her eyes filled, Vaughn reached for her hand and held it firm, the way he always had, quiet, certain, without hesitation. Afterward, they ate roasted chicken and biscuits beneath the sky, with the children chasing each other barefoot through the grass. Vaughn carved their initials into the porch rail, and Rhetta added the date beneath, her hand sure with the knife. That night, after the children had gone to bed, she stood beside him at the doorway, the lantern casting gold across her face. "I never thought I'd have a home again," she said. "Not really. You built it," he said. "With your own two hands." They went to bed in the same room for the first time, no separate cots, no distance between them. Just two people who had lived through enough to understand the worth of quiet love and shared breath. His hand found hers beneath the quilt, and she turned toward him, every line of her body soft with trust. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Years passed. The land grew thick with crops and years and laughter. Micah grew into a tall, quiet man with his own patch of pasture and a good eye for horses. Maisie took to drawing, her fingers always ink-stained, her stories stitched into the margins of her papers. Rhetta taught reading to the neighbor children in the front room, her voice strong through the open window. Vaughn built her a rocker that faced west, where the light was longest in the evenings. He still rode the ridge some mornings, but he always came home before supper. They aged with grace, the kind that comes from weather and work and choosing each other every day. And on the porch, beneath the carved initials, they sat each evening, her hand in his, the way it had always been.